This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 973 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog. Thanks for tuning in. We got the official list of NFL Combine invites last week, which means it's officially prospect season. I know some of you aren't as interested in that side of fantasy football. You'd rather just wait and see where these guys get drafted rather than learning about them over the next couple of months. And I get that. My prospecting work won't be for everyone. But I do think having a general understanding of the incoming rookies each year can help you in any fantasy format. Of course, it's going to be helpful in Dynasty for your rookie drafts, or some of the best ball contests going on right now over on Underdog. But even in your normal redraft leagues, having an understanding of these players is crucial. Not just during your drafts, but with waiver wire management as well. Now, I do a series of episodes each year, with this one being the first, as sort of an introduction to the class. Today's episode is about running backs. Next week, it's going to be all about wide receivers. But the concept is pretty simple. I look at successful NFL players at those two positions, and I see what kind of collegiate production traits those players shared. Then, I look at the current class, and I see if any of the draft hopeful players appear to be studs based on their collegiate production. But we'll talk through all of that in just a minute. First, the Late Round Prospect Guide. It's available for pre-order right now. You should check it out. This year's guide is even more information than ever before. You get info on everything that goes into my prospect and year 2 models. You get profiles for every running back and wide receiver at this year's combine. You get year 2 profiles for about 40 second-year running backs and wide receivers. And I've added what I'm calling categories to the model this year that help categorize players into these buckets depending on their overall scores in both the ZAP model and the year 2 one. I'm putting a lot of work into this. I think you guys are going to enjoy it. You can pre-order it right now over on lateround.com. It's $14.99. On March 10th, when it launches, that price is going to go up by $5. Also, even though the fantasy football season is over, is it actually over? Because over on Underdog right now, you can enter drafts for the 2025 season. If you know prospects well, if you have a good grasp on free agency, you can really have an edge on your competition. And you can use today's episode to help you out. If you want to check it out, head to underdogfantasy.com and sign up. When you do, make sure you use promo code LATEROUND to get up to $1,000 in bonus cash. That's underdogfantasy.com. So the goal today is to look at successful NFL running backs in recent history and see if their college production marks match up with any of the prospects in this year's draft class. Because whether people want to believe it or not, college production can be predictive. Who would have thought when a player is successful in college, he has a higher likelihood to be successful in the NFL? This is really where my ZAP model comes into play, where it stems from. I've worked on the wide receiver and running back ZAP models for years now, and I update them with new ideas every offseason. Those models are based on things like draft capital, certain college production metrics, player size, program strength, and so on. Again, all of this is outlined in the prospect guide. I made a semi-substantial update to the running back model this offseason that allowed it to get more signal and be more predictive. I was a little hesitant to do it, but I do think it makes sense. It's just going to confuse literally everyone when I say this, but here goes. The running back ZAP model no longer includes any rushing metrics. How is that possible? Why would a running back model not use rushing related metrics? Well, it uses a couple of pass catching metrics. So college production isn't just totally tossed out the window. But what I've realized is that a lot of the rushing marks are just simply captured in other things that the model's looking at. Draft capital being that top thing. You see, these ZAP models, they're not attempting to predict where a player is going to get drafted or what round he'll be drafted in. Instead, they're mostly telling you post-draft when you should deviate from draft capital. And it seems like for purposes of fantasy football, teams aren't factoring in receiving enough at the running back position. It's not that they don't care. It's just that the game of fantasy football at the running back position, it's very pass catching driven. I'm measuring against full PPR output. So the receiving angle matters even more. But it matters in any format. Not only that, but when a player has a more robust receiving profile, it's signaling to us that they may be pretty talented. We should assume that the majority of these running backs saw a pretty good amount of work on the ground. To then also be good through the air tells us that they might be pretty well-rounded. And when you're well-rounded, you're talented, you're good. You're going to score more fantasy points. That's my guess as to why the receiving stuff matters so much. So the two main production metrics that the running back model now uses are best season reception share, which is prorated for games played, and then a metric I use called breakout score. Breakout score used to be based on yards per team play by a running back, which would include both rushing and receiving yards. But now it's just based on receiving yards per team pass attempt, which is the exact same thing that the wide receiver model uses. It's called breakout score because it's looking at that from an age-adjusted perspective. I won't bore you with all the details here, but it looks at the age of a player when he does certain things in the receiving yards per team pass attempt metric, and then it adjusts for strength of opponent. Breakout score gets pretty good signal in the running back model, especially when attached to all the other stuff that goes into that model. Standalone, though, it wouldn't make that much sense for me to only talk about receiving metrics on today's show. Because remember what the goal is here. We're looking at stud NFL running backs and seeing how their collegiate production compares to the guys in this year's class. Only looking at receiving metrics wouldn't tell us that much of a story. It's just helpful for the model. So this is what we're going to do. I'm going to look at those two main ZAP model production metrics, which, by the way, ZAP stands for Zachary Eason Adjusted Prospect Model. Very creative, I know. But those two metrics are reception share and breakout score. But I'm also going to look at best season yards per team play. That's a metric that's proven to correlate to NFL success. It takes a player's total yards, so both rushing and receiving, and divides it by the number of plays that his team ran in a given season. We'll then take those metrics and then layer on top our two different samples. One sample includes our stud NFL running backs. The other sample includes players who are invited to the 2025 NFL Combine. The latter sample is really easy to define. They're players who were invited to the Combine. But the former, not so much. What exactly defines a successful NFL running back? Well, arbitrarily, I've defined them as players since 2011 with multiple seasons of 14 or more PPR points per game. Basically, players who are giving fantasy managers multiple RB2 or better seasons. So they didn't just get there once and then fall off a cliff. They had some sustained success. The ZAP model includes running backs who were either drafted or at the NFL Combine since 2011. So some of the stud players like an Adrian Peterson, he can't be part of our stud running back sample because he was drafted before 2011. I don't have a breakout score for him. So after removing those players, we get 33 running backs, 33 stud NFL running backs. Running backs who gave us 2 or more seasons of 14 plus PPR points per game since 2011. Now, the idea here is to compare their collegiate profiles, those 33 stud NFL running backs, to the collegiate profiles of the 31 running backs who were invited to this year's Combine. So let's start with prorated reception share. This just looks at the number of receptions a player had versus the number of receptions his entire team had. A solid number for best season reception share is usually over 10, 11, 12%. If a player is over 15%, that's really solid. Our running back stud sample had an average best season reception share of 13.9%. It's not surprising that that number's high because, again, when running backs are good in the NFL, they were generally good in college. I also wouldn't be using these metrics if they were worthless. Meanwhile, this year's running back draft class, their average best season reception share was 11.7%. That's honestly really good. This class, for those of you who don't know, this class looks great on paper. The ZAP model likes a lot of backs in this class. Right now in February, it looks like a top 3 class since 2011, depending on how you measure it. Breakout score is again based on receiving yards per team pass attempt. The score is a raw number that gets translated into a number between 0 to 100 to make things a little bit easier to comprehend and consume. The stud NFL running back sample had an average breakout score in college of nearly 77. This year's class was at 62. So once again, the stud sample was better. And then, like I said, I'm also going to look at best season total yards per team play, even though that metric is no longer in the model. The stud sample had a mark of 2.01 in that metric. This year's class, 1.79. So across the board, our stud sample is better than this year's class, which is not that surprising because this year's class is going to include a whole lot of day 3 and undrafted picks. The stud sample will have some of those guys in it, but they already hit. And then there's a lot of first rounders and second rounders. So the question now is, which of the backs in this year's class seem to match some of this criteria? Well, before I give you the list of players who did match it, let's look at some of the higher profile running backs in this class who didn't get there. Guys that I refer to as having red flags. Now keep in mind, a player being lower in one of these production metrics doesn't mean that that player is going to look bad in the ZAP model or even be bad in the NFL. It's just one input of many inputs. We'll start with prorated reception share. In our stud sample, we only have 7 running backs who failed to reach a 10% reception share. And some of them are some of the lower tiered players in that stud NFL sample. But the list of guys who didn't get there were Carlos Hyde, Doug Martin, Nick Chubb, Josh Jacobs, Devontae Freeman, Chris Carson, and Derrick Henry. Henry had the lowest. He was the only one below 5%. But he's also been the outlier of all outliers throughout his NFL career. Also, the ZAP model is predicting point per game output across a player's first 3 years in the NFL. Henry didn't really have his breakout until year 4. Anyway, in this year's class, we have 12 players who failed to get to a 10% reception share. That's actually a pretty low number, all things considered. It just goes to show how good this class actually is. Now, unfortunately, both Ohio State running backs fall into this category. Travion Henderson had a 9.7% best season prorated reception share. He barely missed this arbitrary cutoff. Quinshon Judkins was at 8.6%. Now, the good news is that the ZAP model has something in it called a teammate score. So both of those players are being helped by that. But overall, I'm not going to be overly concerned about this, especially for Henderson, who the model seems to really like. And Judkins is fine too. But Henderson has a breakout score of about 91. Judkins is at 55. And Henderson had the higher total yards per team play in his best season. But overall, I wouldn't call this a huge red flag because both guys were at least competing with good players in the offenses that they were in. Now, the running back with the highest projected draft capital according to NFL mock draft database outside of the Ohio State guys, who is below that 10% reception share mark, is Dylan Sampson. You know, it's funny. Sampson would be pretty okay in last year's draft class. Last year's draft class not being nearly as strong as this year's. Like, he's better than a lot of guys that we saw a year ago. But right now, the model doesn't hate him. It just doesn't love him. He's got an 8.5% prorated best season reception share, a number that was exceeded by 28 of the 33 guys in the NFL stud sample. And for what it's worth, he has a breakout score of 53. That's fine, but nothing elite. There's nothing that really stands out about his analytical profile in the model. Now, the nice part is, outside of those 3 players, there aren't really any running backs with huge projected draft capital who had low reception shares. Damian Martinez of Miami, who was at Oregon State, he's another one who didn't have the best receiving profile. But he's projected to go like 150th overall. So let's just move on to breakout score. I think breakout score is more interesting because it's more predictive, but it's also age and program adjusted. In the NFL stud sample, just 6 of our 33 running backs had a breakout score below 50. And unsurprisingly, many of them coincide with the ones that I talked about earlier. Derrick Henry, Chris Carson, Doug Martin, and Carlos Hyde are all on that list. So the vast majority of running backs in that stud sample are at least average when it comes to breakout score. It's obviously a little bit different in this year's class. But just to show you how freaking good this class is, we only have 9 of the 31 with a breakout score below 50. For context, in 2024, 15 of the 29 running backs in the model had a breakout score below 50. So we're talking just 29% from this year's class and over 50% from last year's class. Anyway, the good news on this front is that no big name players below that mark in this year's class. Again, I'm going to reference NFLMockDraftDatabase.com for projected draft capital here. But Damian Martinez, who I just talked about, he's the top projected running back who didn't have a breakout score of 50. Not only was his score 47, so he was really close, But again, he's projected to go 146th overall right now, give or take a handful of spots. Phil Maffa is another one who just didn't get it done as a receiver in college. He played 4 years at Clemson. His top season in reception share was under 7%. His breakout score didn't register because he maxed out at just 108 receiving yards in a given season. That gave him a low receiving yards per team pass attempt. But that's really it. I mean, it might be frustrating that I'm not revealing something huge here, but at the same time, it's kind of awesome that the running backs who are projected to get drafted high this year also come with pretty strong production profiles in the ZAP model. We don't always get that. Now, lastly, there's yards per team play. I don't have this in the model anymore, but it can't hurt to look at it because there is some predictiveness to it. In our stud NFL sample, just 6 running backs were below a 1.5 max season yards per team play rate. Again, that's total yards, so rushing and receiving, divided by team plays. We only have 7 in this year's class. I can't stress enough how good this class looks analytically. We'll see post-combine, but right now it's looking good. One player below that mark is Trevor Etienne. And honestly, the early results of the ZAP model actually really like Etienne. He had a best season prorated reception share of 13.3%. His breakout score is about 77. Those are very strong numbers, especially for a guy who should come in around 200 pounds, hopefully a little bit heavier, who's not even 21 years old, and who's projected to be a day 3 pick. A huge reason his yards per team play profile is lacking is because he didn't see a ton of work on the ground throughout college at Florida and Georgia. He was really efficient per touch, but volume is generally a lot more predictive than efficiency from college to the NFL. But he got it done through the air, and he did so at a young age. So he's one of the later-ish running backs that I'm currently interested in. And there are some others too. Now, not all of them hit on every average of the 3 metrics from our NFL stud sample, meaning the average that we saw out of reception share, breakout score, and yards per team play. But there are some later round running backs this year who look good within the 2 metrics that go into the ZAP model. Again, those are reception share and breakout score. One of them is Woody Marks out of Southern Cal. His best season reception share was 16%. His breakout score, about 81. But this is one of those scenarios where we do have to give these numbers some context. We should always give these numbers some context. That's going to happen. The model's predictive, but it's also just a guide. Marks played at Mississippi State for 4 years before going to USC. So he's an older prospect, which is a red flag. But when he was at Mississippi State, his head coach was the late Mike Leach. Leach is known for his air raid offense. And he was also known for getting his running backs involved in that offense through the air. So I do think that Marks' numbers are a little bit inflated here. And you can make a similar argument for Brashard Smith out of SMU. His numbers being a little bit inflated. That's because he played wide receiver for his first 3 years of his collegiate career at Miami. Now, some of you might consider this a blind spot with the ZAP model, because every once in a while we get a player like this. Tyrone Tracy was one of these players last year, but Tracy was also a nice hit versus his draft capital. So Tracy's breakout score is awesome, but it was also kind of warranted. Smith's isn't as high, and for what it's worth, as a running back at SMU this past year, he still had good receiving numbers. It wasn't just a function of him playing wide out. But I'm excited to see what he might be able to do at the combine. I'm also interested in Bashal Tutin. His reception share numbers are a little bit boosted because he played at North Carolina A&T for a couple of years before transferring to Virginia Tech. Now, his breakout score adjusts for that program strength, but the reception share does not. Even still, in 2024 with Virginia Tech, he got to almost a 14% reception share. And with all the necessary adjustments with receiving yards per team play, Tutin still has a breakout score of 74. He was honestly pretty close to meeting the criteria of a stud running back. And then the last player that I want to get to before revealing the true production studs from this year's class is LaQuint Allen. Allen absolutely checks the production boxes in the ZAP model because his receiving profile was absolutely bonkers at Syracuse. He caught 64 passes for 521 yards last year. And he was productive as a pass catcher before that too. That gives him a breakout score of 91 and a best season reception share of almost 20%. Those are some of the better marks that you're going to find in this year's class. But there are 3 running backs who hit the averages from the stud NFL sample in all 3 metrics that we're looking at today. So they have better than a 13.9% reception share, better than a 77 breakout score, and better than a 2.01 best season yards per team play. Ashton Jeanty is one of them. Surprise, surprise. Anyone who follows college football, even casually, knows about Jeanty. He's an elite prospect in this class who's going to immediately become a top running back in Dynasty. I mean, he's kind of already there. He did face slightly easier competition, but it didn't matter. His best season reception share is over 23%. His breakout score, which adjusts for all of that, is 95.2. His total yards per team play is 2.82, which is best in the class. Jeanty is an elite prospect. The next one is Cam Skattebo. He looks great analytically. He has a best season reception share above 20%, a breakout score of 95.9, a high-end yards per team play. The Zap model really likes him. And then the last one is another popular back in this year's class. It's Caleb Johnson, albeit barely. I'd say Jeanty and Skattebo probably have the most well-rounded analytical profiles in this class. And then there's a little bit of a drop. But Johnson's still good. His breakout score was 80.4 though, so it was barely above that 77 mark. But he's a very solid-looking prospect early for me. So to the Zap model and just general analytics, Jeanty, Skattebo, and Caleb Johnson look like really solid bets. And for those of you wondering, Amarian Hampton, he's pretty close. His breakout score, though, ended up being 64, so he was just off there. But he looks like a really good prospect, too. It's just a really good class overall. The higher-end players look solid, and like I said, there's a lot of day 3 picks that I'm excited to watch at the Combine. It's obviously still very, very early on in this process. But this is at least giving us a nice baseline to work off of. I can't wait to put it all together in that prospect guide. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and on Blue Sky at Late Round QB. Remember, you can pre-order that prospect guide right now over on the site. Otherwise, I've got a great late round perspectives guest for you later this week. I'll talk to you then.